This is part 2 of the scriptures in the 21st century. Last Shabbat, we embarked on our journey through the scriptures. During our journey, we will be looking at many aspects of the scriptures, particularly as they relate to the period in which we are now living. In our last session, we also looked at the close relationship between the words of Torah and the words spoken by Yeshua during his earthly ministry, where we saw through Yochanan or John 1, verses 1 to 3, there is a direct connection between Yeshua and the events that took place during the creative cycle. However, both the sequence and the magnitude of the creative task that was spoken about in Bereshit chapter 1 must have taken far longer than 6 literal 24-hour days. So the question that must be asked is, why has the idea of 6 literal days been the fundamental doctrinal teaching of both rabbinical Judaism and Christianity for over 2 millennia? I believe the answer comes through the words of Daniel chapter 12, particularly in verse 4, which we read this morning. You, Daniel, keep the words secret and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will rush here and there, and knowledge will increase. So looking at chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Daniel was told, when that time comes, Michael, who champions your people, will stand up, and there will be a time of distress, unparalleled between the time they became a nation and that moment. At that time your people will be delivered, everyone whose name is found in the book. Many of those sleeping in the dust of the earth will awaken, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting shame and abhorrence. But those who discern will shine like the brightness of heaven's dome, and those who turn many to righteousness will be like stars in the sky forever. I believe we are now living in the time where those words are coming to fruition. So it is time for that concealed message of Scripture to be made clearly visible. Along with the clear understanding of the current world's events, it is also time for us to lay aside the traditional understandings of the creation. So what has changed in relatively recent years that will help us to understand the scriptural narrative more clearly than our forebears were able to do? I believe the answer lies in the insights that were given through the Ruach HaKodesh to 2 Jewish men early in the 20th century. The former became highly esteemed, while the latter became infamous. The first was Albert Einstein, who, in 1905, brought forth the law of special relativity, which, of course, is expressed through the equation E equals mc squared. It was a revolutionary breakthrough in the understanding of both time and space. The other man was Emanuel Velikovsky, who, in 1945, brought forth clear evidence that throughout history, the history of the universe, and latterly during the history of mankind, planet Earth had undergone many catastrophic changes, and changes to the earthbound perception of time and distance. Such changes impacted on the seasons and dates to such an extent that various empires throughout history have had to constantly adjust their calendars. However, the findings published in the books resulted in Velikovsky being vilified by most of the scientific community because they had collectively adopted the doctrine that all things in the natural world have evolved in a continuum since the beginning of time. The work of those 2 men has transformed the way science and many lay people, including myself, understand the world around us. Further, the work of both have unlocked many mysteries of Scripture that were never considered in bygone periods of human history. Turning firstly to Einstein's theory of E equals mc squared, we find embodied in that equation an expression of the whole universe and its creation. E For the equation expresses the essence of the Eternal One, God, who was the creator of the whole physical universe. And the mc squared is the material universe itself, matter, travelling outward from the point of its beginning in every direction. Then, just 40 years later, scientists proved the relationship between E, being pure energy, and M, being the matter of the universe, when two nuclear devices were exploded over Japan in 1945. The result of those two bombs was the transformation of large amounts of matter back into pure energy. Hence, the world saw that parts of the material universe can be returned to the original form from which matter began. So when we apply this level of awareness to the creative narrative, we begin to see the time involved in the formation of the universe is far greater than 6 24-hour days. By applying the law of special relativity to the creation of the universe, we begin to see that the Eternal One, God, did not play with his laws of nature, which he himself had created. He did not act like a magician and manipulate his physical laws to make things happen in an instant. Instead, the Eternal One applied those physical laws to create all that was brought into existence. After having created each new entity during the creative cycle, and newly formed entities were each given time to develop. So with that frame of reference as our starting point, we can now consider those 6 creative cycles, which are known in Hebrew as yoms. In the English-speaking world, of course, it's day. So starting in Bereshit, chapter 1, verse 1, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The verse provides no time constraint. It just occurred without reference to time. E became M and expanded in every direction for an unspecified period of time. Hence, the development phase between verses 1 and 2 could have been in the order of billions of years, which allowed planet Earth to consolidate from a mass of gas and dust early in the universe into a water-covered rock floating through space, as determined or defined in verse 2, where it says, "The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water." The Spirit of God, as we saw last Shabbat, was Yeshua, the Word, where, in verse 3, he began to focus his attention toward planet Earth. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So, beginning with the lengthy process of preparing planet Earth for the habitation by humanity, the details of which are recorded in the remaining part of Bereshit chapter 1. And looking more closely at verse 3, we see that no reference is made to either the sun, moon, or the stars. So how could the light cast upon the surface of the water? If we acknowledge what scientists have been able to prove empirically during the 20th century, then it follows that the sun that already existed it would have been in existence since the creation of the universe in verse 1. Hence, in verse 3, the sun was being enabled to shine upon the surface of the waters, covering this lifeless planet. If we consider for a moment the effect of volcanic eruptions, we see that many large eruptions throughout the history of humanity have thrown up millions of tons of dust and ash into the atmosphere, with the result, of course, that the rays of the sun can almost be completely obscured from the surface of the earth for a prolonged period. One such volcanic winter occurred in 536 CE, when at least 3 volcanic eruptions ejected a massive amount of sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, and they reduced the solar radiation reaching the surface of the Earth and cooled the atmosphere by over 2.5 degrees C for a period of several years. So if we acknowledge that during the early stages of the creation of the universe, there would have been highly elevated temperatures and molten rock existing on the surface of the Earth for a prolonged period, hence the atmosphere surrounding the Earth would have been choked with dust and would have reflected the sun's rays back into space, rather than allowing the light to penetrate down to the surface waters. The dense clouds of dust, water vapor would have kept the Earth's atmosphere at the surface at a very high level for many millennia. This understanding, I believe, is confirmed through the words again of Immanuel Velikovsky, who found from his research that there had been many interplanetary exchanges during and before human history, which caused massive disruptions to both the movements and the climatic conditions of the planets of our solar system, including the Earth. In the epilogue to his book World and Collision, Velikovsky set forth his belief that because of these planetary interactions, the resultant dust clouds would have caused the surface temperature of Venus, Earth's nearest neighbor, to be still in the order of around 315 degrees C, even now. By contrast, the world of the mid-20th century vehemently denied his conclusions, claiming that the ground temperature of Venus would be close to that of Earth, something like between 5 and 20 degrees C. However, when Mariner 2 space probe in December 1962 passed by Venus, found the surface temperature was actually 427 degrees C, far hotter than even Velikovsky had predicted. The evidence found by that first mission proved that the heavy blanket of cloud surrounding Venus held the surface temperature well above the Earth's present temperature. So why has Venus remained so hot? I believe it's reasonable to assume that at the time when God started preparing the planet Earth for human habitation, the atmosphere here would have been just like it was on Venus, so dense that it would have prevented the light of the sun reaching the surface of the Earth. But in Bereshit 1 verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Going on to verses 4 and 5, he said, God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called light day, and darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning, one day. With that statement, God divided the light from the darkness, which appeared to be related to the Earth's rotation, which would have become apparent only when the light reached down to the surface of the planet. In the absence of light on the surface of the water, there would have been no perception of rotation until the light broke through. God saw the light was good, and the difference between the light and darkness he named day and night. Such a concept could not be contemplated in the absence of planetary rotation. Much later, as we know, humans produced sundials as a way of breaking up the passage of time into measurable portions, which we now, of course, call hours, minutes, and seconds. However, the idea of dividing time into measurable portions has nothing to do with what we're reading about in the statement in verse 5, where God said, "So there was evening and there was morning one day." God's apparent reference to evenings and mornings as being part of one day has led to the erroneous belief that each creative period was also a 24-hour day, assuming each creative cycle was 6 24-hour cycles, But in reality, God was not confined by man's measure of time. So as we considered in the last episode, the Hebrew word yom, which is behind the English word day, can denote a measure of time, which can vary in length. Therefore, in this situation, the period being referred to as evenings and mornings, as was the period between two creative cycles, when what had been produced in the previous cycle was given a period in which to develop and produce. Therefore, when the period evenings and morning is considered in the context of chapter 1, it is the period that cannot be considered just as one single rotation of planet Earth. The scriptural proof that God was not talking about 24-hour day cycles is borne out in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, when God says God rested from his creative works. Hence, because God rested on the seventh day, he called it holy, or set apart. So if his rest from creation had been just one 24-hour cycle, then he would have started creating, and would still be creating even now in the 21st century. But last Shabbat, we also considered the answer to the words in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, where Shaul was speaking about Israel entering into God's rest. Those two chapters were written to the first century Talmudim of Yeshua, to remind them about how their forefathers, the ones who'd come out of Egypt, died in the wilderness and did not enter into God's rest. So Shaul said, if the Talmudim of his time and beyond that period could turn back to Yahweh, they could also enter into his rest. So if it applied in the first century CE, it still also applies that we too can enter into his rest in the 21st century. God has remained the same right through. Therefore, the evenings and mornings in Bereshit chapter 1 must relate to a much greater period than a 24-hour day. Again, also is confirmed by 2 Kepha, or Peter, chapter 3, verse 8, where he says, Dear friends, do not ignore this. With the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. So if God considers 1,000 years to be like one day, it's equally reasonable to assume his Shabbat rest can also be 7,000 years long. That is, 6,000 years for human development, followed by another 1,000 years of restoration, as stated in Revelation chapter 20. All that can occur because God rested, just as he said in Bereshit chapter 2 verse 3, when speaking about his whole creation, so that it itself can produce. However, that still leaves one additional question. Why does the period between each creative phase begin in the evening? Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, or the Old Testament, we find the evening comes before morning in each day. So having earlier established the pre-existence of Earth's rotation, God saw that it was good and allowed the period between evening and morning as a development phase before he embarked on the next creative cycle. As we have seen in the first creative cycle, God said, "Let there be light." So until the rays of the sun reached the waters of the surface of the earth, there had been only darkness or night. Therefore, the darkness preceded the light. So also, evening precedes the dawn in the Hebrew-speaking world. And moving on, we see in verses 6 through 8 that God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the water. Let it divide the water from the water." God made the dome and divided the water under the dome from the water above the dome. That is how it was, and God called the dome sky. So there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. So having enabled the sun to shine through the atmosphere down to the surface of the deep water, God then moved to the next phase of creation, where God said in verse 7 that the waters were divided vertically. The waters on the surface of the earth were separated from the water that was taken up to the upper level of the atmosphere. A substantial amount of water must have been raised to the upper limits of the atmosphere so that the dome between the upper and the lower bodies of water could be called sky. As we now know from space exploration, the planet is surrounded by sky, rising from the surface of the ground and the sea to the edge of space. There are many layers within the sky, which scientists have called atmosphere. So in verses 6 through 8, during the second creative day, part of the water from the surface of the earth was lifted up to the upper limits of the sky. The raising of a massive quantity of water vapor would have required a complete transformation of the terrestrial dynamics. Hence, vast amounts of heat would have been required to enable the surface water to vaporize. Therefore, with the sun's rays finally reaching the surface of the deep, immense quantities of water would have been vaporized progressively and risen up to the upper limits of the atmosphere, where it would have been suspended as dense clouds. By contrast, the entire vaporization was reversed in Bereshit chapter 6, when God flooded the earth. Much of the water that had risen from the surface during the second creative day was again dumped upon the surface to form a global flood. As Bereshit chapter 7 verse 12 says, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. So most of the water vapor from above the dome condensed and fell back to earth. Yet again, the terrestrial dynamics must have changed within and up, with the initial upward process being completely reversed. Emmanuel Velikovsky, in his book Worlds and Collision, also speaks at length about how there is a geological evidence in this earth of interplanetary encounter at the time of the flood of Noah. God also speaks about another destruction yet to come upon the earth, but not as a result of the water, as in the times of Noah, but destruction by fire at the return of Yeshua. 2 Kepha chapter 3 verse 10, we are told, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. On that day the heavens will disappear with a roar, and the elements will melt and disintegrate, and the earth and everything in it will be burned up. So if the elements are going to melt, there will also again be intense heat on the earth, as it would have been in the early stages of the universe, well before human habitation. Such increased heating must also occur with another interplanetary conflagration, such as Velikovsky had proven in his book. Now, Velikovsky's arguments also are confirmed through the words of 2 Kepha chapter 3, where he, Kepha, speaks about the heavens and the earth before the flood as being part of the creative narrative. But what was destroyed by the flood of Noah was the civilization of that time. The heavens and the earth, that is the atmosphere and the physical planet itself, survived completely in a renewed form. Only breathing creatures were destroyed in the flood, not the planet itself. In the same way, the present heavens and the earth are being stored up for destruction by fire. Therefore, if our planet survived through the flood of Noah, it also will survive through the destruction by fire. So Kepha concludes that chapter speaking about new heavens and a new earth being the place where righteousness will dwell. Next we come to verses 9 through 11, where God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." So that is how it was. God called the dry land earth, and gathered the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth put forth grass and seed-producing plants and fruit trees, each yielding its own kind of seed-bearing fruit on the earth." And that is how it was. The earth brought forth grass, plants yielding its own kind of seed, and trees producing its own kind of seed-bearing fruit. And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a third day. During that third day, not only did the dry ground appear, but also the vegetation, including the seed-bearing plants. As the ground dried up, it became covered with oxygen-releasing plant life, which filled the sky with breathable air, in the preparation for animal life, which is yet to follow. Over the same prolonged period, the seas would have also absorbed oxygen and become capable of supporting marine life. But no leafy green plant can grow in the absence of sunlight. The plants spoken about in verses 11 and 12 could not grow unless the sun was already shining brightly through the earth's atmosphere. The events of the third day clearly indicate that the sun, the moon, and the stars were already in place and functioning perfectly before the narrative of Bereshit chapter 1 began. Therefore, looking at the progression of the creative narrative from a 21st century perspective, it is completely clear that the sun, the moon, and the stars already existed and became visible on the fourth day. Because the oxygenation of the atmosphere and the seas and the resulting plant life growing between days 3 and 4 enabled the atmosphere to finally become clear enough for those celestial objects to be visible from the surface of the earth. Further, we now know that from the world's oldest living tree, that is the great giant sequoia, based on its ring count, is at least 3,200 years old. Therefore, it follows that the vegetation created during that third day may well have taken anything up to 3,500 years to develop and mature during the development phase of the evening and morning of the third day. That is why God could, without any contradiction of his laws of nature, speak the way he did in verses 14 through 19, where he said, "And let them be lights in the dome of the sky, to give light to the earth." And that is how it was. God made two great lights, the larger light to rule the day and the smaller light to rule the night, and the stars. God put them in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good, and there was evening and morning, a fourth day. We now know from scientific evidence that the sun, moon, and the stars were never placed in the dome of the sky, as verse 17 suggests, by saying God put them in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth. So what actually did happen on that fourth day was that the sun, the moon, and the stars became visible through the dome of the sky for the first time on that fourth day. But they had been there since the forming of the universe. So once the upper water canopy and in the dome of the sky became transparent, it would have appeared to the ancient writers that the sun, the moon, and the stars had actually appeared for the first time in the dome of the sky. However, as we know, the sun is approximately 93 million miles from the earth. The moon is 240,000 miles from the earth. Both measurements clearly indicate that God never put them in the dome of the sky, between the upper and lower waters. It just appeared that way. Their light became visible through the dome. The clarification of the air may well have also taken a considerable amount of time, which would have been accelerated by, of course, the plant growth, which is oxygenating the air within the dome of the sky. But it may well have taken 3,500 years during the period of the evening and the morning of the fourth day. Then came the dawn of the fifth day, when in verse 20 to 23, God said, "Let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth in the open dome of the sky." God created the great sea creatures and every living thing that creeps. So the water swarmed with all its kinds, and there was every kind of winged bird, and God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the water of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." So there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. Having planted and produced the seed-bearing fruit and the grasses on the dry land during the third day, God then turned his attention to the waters of the sea and the air of the sky, where he placed swarming living creatures. As the dome of the sky was being clarified by oxygenation during the third day, and also the waters of the sea had been cleansed, the cleansing process during the third and fourth days would have also caused extensive chemical fallout, much of which would have landed in the sea. So in the early stages of the cleansing process, the sea, having become a chemical soup with particles needing to be settled to the bottom, the whole purification period would have required a vast quantity of low-level marine life helping to the cleansing process. Therefore, on the fifth day, God said, "Let the water swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the dome of the sky." So as the food chain in both the sea and on the dry land increased, the overall biodynamics of the ocean and the land would have changed dramatically. The ever-increasing sunlight below the surface of the sea would have turned the deposited chemicals into harmless particles which slowly descended towards the seabed. Coupled with the high initial sea temperatures and the abundance of nutrients, plankton and other algae types of organisms would have flourished in copious quantities, turning the seas from a chemical soup into clear oxygenated water that could support higher forms of marine life. Then in verse 21, God created the great sea creatures. The food for many species of whale is plankton. So by creating the great sea creatures, God created a balance for the abundant volumes of plankton in relationship to the higher forms of life. In that same verse, it also speaks about every living thing that creeps. By creating crayfish, shellfish, and other bottom feeders, God enabled the cycle of cleansing to be completed. Plankton near the surface would have photosynthesized carbonates and other biochemicals that would slowly sink towards the bottom as debris. The bottom-feeding crustaceans would have ingested much of that descending material, neutralizing and depositing the particles into sediment. Then, increasing pressure from the weight of the water would, over time, transform those crustaceans into limestone, sandstone, and other sedimentary rocks, which still are evident on the shorelines of the world today. It is little wonder that God, in his wisdom, instructed his own people, Israel, that they were to abstain from eating marine life, other than fish with scales and fins. Shellfish and creeping things are cleansers of the ocean, not suitable as food for his people. During that same period, the abundance of green leafy vegetation growing in the warm atmosphere of the dried earth would have oxygenated the air in the dome of the sky. So that in verse 21, God filled the air with all kinds of birds. Birds flying over the land and the sea would have spread seeds over an ever wider area of the planet Earth's landmass. In verses 22 to 23, God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, fill the water of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." So there was evening and there morning on the 5th day. God gave the sea creatures and the birds time to multiply during that period between the 5th and the 6th creative days. Then during the 6th creative phase, we are told in verse 24 and 25, God said, "Let the earth bring forth all kinds of living creatures, each kind of livestock, crawling animals and wild beasts." That is how it was. God made each kind of wild beast, each kind of living livestock, and every kind of animal that crawls upon the ground. And God said that it was good. In the biospheric conditions, with the water canopy above the sky, the grass and other leafy plants, including trees, would have grown at an incredible rate. Which is why scientists hypothesize that back in geological times, millions of years, the dinosaurs and similar vegetation-eating mammals roamed the earth. However, from a scriptural perspective, it makes far more sense that the dinosaurs and large vegetation-eating animals coexisted with humans from the latter part of the 6th creative day right through until the flood of Noah, when all of them were swept away. Therefore, their sole function would have been to reduce that vast quantity of vegetation so that the smaller, higher forms of breathing animals could survive and multiply. Then, in the latter stages of the 6th creative day, when the planet was clean and lush, God created his final, highest fleshly form, humanity. As verse 26 and 20 through 28 say, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the animals all over the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living creature that crawls on the earth." Finally, after that long, slow development process, God finally had planet conditions that he wanted for humankind. If my line of reasoning is correct, God used all his natural laws of the universe to transform a dead and lifeless rock that was covered with water and enveloped in dense cloud into a jewel of the solar system, ready for habitation by humans. The beauty of this planet has been marveled at by astronauts as they stood on the moon and saw the surface of the earth rise from below the horizon of the moon. There was the bright blue-green sphere dotted with red-brown patches of dry ground, all covered in wisps of cloud. So having prepared the planet for humanity, God said in verses 29 and 30, "Throughout the whole earth I am giving you as food every seed-bearing plant and every tree with seed-bearing fruit, and to every wild animal bird of the air and creature crawling on the earth, in which there is a living soul, I am giving as food every kind of green plant. That is how it was. There was no need for competition for food, because God had provided every type of food that was needed for every type of creature, including the food suitable for humans. So in verse 31, God said everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. So there was evening and there was morning on the sixth day. God was well pleased with all he had achieved. It was now time for God to rest from all the works that he had undertaken. So began the seventh creative day, during which God has rested from all his creative work, so that each life form could grow and multiply in abundance. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, is explained where God gives a summary of all that had transpired during the 6 creative cycles. As it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, along with everything in them. On the seventh day, God finished with his work that he had made. So he rested on the seventh day from all his creative work that he had made. God blessed the seventh day and separated it as holy, because on that day God rested from all his work which he had created, so that it could produce. So as we saw in the first episode, God stepped aside and let the next 7,000 years be a time for humans to multiply and subdue the earth, fill it with offspring, so that God continued resting and will continue resting until the 8th creative day, when all things will finally be brought back to the way they were meant to be when he ceased working at the end of that 6th creative day. During that 8th day, the sovereign plan of God will be complete. He will invoke, this time in reverse, E equals MC squared, by Satan and his adversaries, and all who follow his calling will be finally turned back into pure energy, just as it existed before the universe was created. They will all cease to exist as part of this material universe. Then, as one final move, Yeshua himself will hand himself back to his Father, and they will become one again, and Yahweh God will be all things to all men. This has been a very long, intense study, but one needs to share these things to a wider audience to counter the misinformation that has been taught for over 2 millennia. It has been necessary for the message of Scripture to have remained unexplained until this 21st century, because the actions of Satan, who had stood defiantly against Yeshua and caused the serpent to deceive both Adam and Havah while they were still in God's garden, right through until this day and beyond, that has been the reason why it has all been kept under wraps until this time. So in the next episode, I will look in more detail at the placement of Adam in Gan Eden and how life developed through the period between the end of that 6th creative day and the flood of Noah. Shabbat Shalom.